Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 37 cheat sheet. And as you guys know, this is one of the final biggest game weeks of the season, which makes it all the more exciting. If you haven't watched the cheat sheet series before and you're embarking on this video for the first time, the cheat sheet is effectively a series where we rank all the FPL assets by position and looking at their price point as well when tiering their effective efficiency, I would say, for the incoming run of game weeks. Now, obviously, we've got 2 game weeks left, so game week 37 is even more important, because I always tend to say that game week 38 is not so illustrative, right? We know that there are some exceptional circumstances that happen in game week 38, teams that rotate a lot, sending offs, of course, and just aberrations, I would say, that happen. But I think what's nice about game week 38 this season is that now that we've actually arrived at game week 38, with the information that we have about the title race, the European spots, I think a lot of things are still live. And a lot of the big teams that we own a lot of players within are playing at home, which makes it all the more better, because I think at least, even if you say the team is nothing to play for, you still have one final game for the season in front of the fans, and I think that's quite significant. Arsenal last season, even though they lost the title race by game week 38, is quite significant, and I think a good example of what happens in game week 38 when things like that happen. So, starting with game week 37, in the midfield position, we have a lot of new changes. The main change actually is, of course, the exceptional shift in Chelsea's form. And of course, the first game where we saw an absolute destruction from Chelsea was actually the Everton 6-0, right? Which I think really was the Cole Palmer show and a lot of individual mistakes from this Everton team. However, I think the biggest game that I would call out to more recently is the second half versus Aston Villa, when Pochettino finally inverted Cucurella and the team started playing effectively like a 3-2-5. Now, what has changed with this team, of course, is that we've started to see more defensive right backs being played. Cucurella himself has also played very well within the system, but Gallagher and Caicedo look a lot more composed as a double pivot within the structure. And really, it's not a double pivot anymore of Caicedo and Gallagher. It's more Gallagher pushing forwards and Caicedo and Cucurella effectively as your defensive mids. And then Gallagher becomes one of those kind of, or rather a key part of that sort of attacking front five that I talked about. So that has been a huge shift for Gallagher, but it's also been a huge shift in general for this Chelsea attack as a whole. We've seen some great performances. I don't think there's necessarily a need to overreact to Chelsea playing extremely well in these last few games, because I think another thing that I'll mention is that they've also been playing versus some very, very poor teams, right? We know West Ham has been categorically a bad defense all season long. It's not surprising to see West Ham finally get destroyed playing the way that they have. And they had a lot of chances for Kudus as well. So it's not like Chelsea has suddenly also become an airtight team. I think it's also the case where, for example, when you look at Tottenham, they've also been notoriously poor. So using that as context, I still think that when you look at Chelsea's fixtures, considering Brighton's drop off in form, that this is a good opportunity to own Chelsea players and to continue having them within your team. And now I think with all the injuries with United as well and the uncertainty around Bruno, but just in general, I mean, look at the quality of the team that's being put out versus Crystal Palace. A lot of things are changing. So Madueke rises and Garnacho falls. Madueke for me rises because, yes, of course, Gallagher has actually open play set pieces, which he shares with Cole Palmer. But the main thing, or rather not open play, but of course set pieces in general. But the main thing with Madueke, I think, is that he's got into much more interesting positions. And of course, his minutes have been shored up. And Nkunku will probably come back before the end of the season. We know that he's been in training, but I think the way that you'll see Nkunku continue to be used is on the left, right? Because Mudryk is probably the worst player within this attacking setup. Jackson can play on the left and Nkunku can play as a 10. He can also play as a striker. But the way I think things will probably go is maybe we'll see Nkunku on the wings, Jackson continue central, Palmer central, and Madueke on the right. So that's been the big change with Chelsea as well. And that's also been helped by, Enzo's hernia condition and his surgery. So that actually happening has allowed Chelsea to effectively play 4 attackers per game. So I don't think I'd be really worried about any Chelsea attacking minutes. So Gallagher rises as well, a set piece taker. As you can see, of course, expected goal involvement per 90 very low, but one of the big things that happens year on year is, of course, we have some tactical shifts within teams. And it's hard to say whether Pochettino will absolutely stick to it towards the end of the season, but they've been playing so well within it, and Gallagher has definitely benefited. So I will give him a rise. And Garnacho, I think, despite his ridiculous price point, you now have a lot of competing options anyways. And I just think that this United team have really bad fixtures. They're away from home versus their easiest fixture, and I'm just not really expecting too much, when they're playing at home, when they're facing Arsenal, Newcastle. Yes, of course, Newcastle have been bad away from home, but I'm sorry, I'm not really seeing what we're supposed to be expecting from a United team ultimately that have completed the season almost playing as if they were a relegation side. And that's the reality, unfortunately, with United, despite their lofty league position. With Johnson, I think he still remains in place. His minutes still look really strong. His underlying stats still look strong. But obviously, we do think that Tottenham have dropped off a bit. Part of the consideration here is, of course, the Man City fixture being there. So that's, of course, a huge blocker on our expectations. Tottenham obviously always have the juju versus Man City. People would say the same thing about United and Arsenal potentially. But considering the positions that Tottenham and Arsenal and United find themselves in, I think it's very likely that Arsenal and City can still get the results that they want versus the two teams. As far as Adingra, he actually was the man of the match for Aston Villa. So a lot of people who might not have watched that game might not have known that he actually also drew the penalty for João Pedro to take, which João Pedro, of course, missed. So, of course, if you're an Anthony Gordon owner or an Adingra owner, you're probably a little bit feeling bad. But Adingra is someone who is, in my opinion, a key attacker for this Brighton team. And him and João Pedro are probably the only two attackers that you have any confidence in whatsoever. I still think he's a differential, but given that you have access to Madueke, who a lot of people don't own, it's very hard to suggest going for Adingra right now. And therefore, he still remains a differential, mostly because we also don't have too much confidence in this Brighton team. As far as the sort of 6-point X position, we've got Richarlison getting a rise as well. Part of the reason why he's getting a rise is because we know that Richarlison coming back from injury was always going to have a limitation on his minutes. And Ange actually mentioned that before his pre-match press conference before Liverpool. In fact, he basically suggested that Richarlison would be benched because Richarlison can't play 2 games in a row. Now, we might have entered a level of match fitness where Richarlison can play 2 matches in a row. But either way, the reality is Richarlison's most likely going to start versus Burnley. And potentially also, if you look at the trend, Sheffield United away at Game Week 38. So I think that just makes Richarlison an amazing pick. We always tend to look at him as an out-of-position player. He's a midfielder at a ridiculous price with crazy underlying stats, particularly underlying stats that are more geared towards the expected goal involvement side of things compared to expected assists. So that's why Richarlison for me is just an amazing pick. Burnley at home just seems like a great game, considering Burnley have to continue to attack and will continue to attack because that is their style. Gross, for the same reason why I didn't really give Adingra a boost, despite him playing very well in that game. I've also got to drop him, or not really drop him, but keep him in place as a differential. Obviously, Brighton is a team that we usually look fondly when they have doubles, but once again, I just think that the fixtures are poor, considering that's Newcastle at home, that they're facing, and also it's Chelsea that they're facing at their own home. So for me, the way that I'm seeing these Brighton fixtures is, first of all, this Chelsea team is actually in a great hot run of form. This Brighton team are probably at its worst when it comes to injuries and also just general overall play, with exception to the Aston Villa game. So I'm not expecting too much from Gross here. He's not on penalties. There's just not much reason to really be that interested in Gross. And the same goes for Maddison as well, right? We can apply the same logic there. He is usually someone who gets set pieces. We're probably not expecting him to be on penalties. He's been playing very poorly, individually as well, which is a big dampener as well. So despite Burnley at home being such a good game, I just think Maddison has to remain as a differential. Havertz is lovely just because I think for Game Week 37-38, considering how bad United look right now, especially just, personnel standpoint, not just the results when it comes to Palace and things like that, Havertz just remains an exceptional punt towards the end of the season. And, if I was to make a decision between the Arsenal midfielders, I think Saka and Havertz are still my go-to picks. Just because Saka, you got penalties, Havertz, just the position that he occupies within the field makes him a huge differential. So for me, I have to drop Odegaard as well, just to be fair to the fact that I think if people really want to prioritize certain Arsenal picks, those are my first 2 go-to options before Odegaard right now. And Fernandes, unfortunately, with the sort of injury situation, apparently it's not just the hand issue that he has, right? So it seems like he's got a muscular issue. I don't think Ten Hag has really elaborated on this issue, and maybe we'll get some news on the pre-match press conferences, and hopefully Bruno will be able to play. But it seems like it's very unlikely that Fernandes is someone that we're too excited by, right? Considering the state of the United team, you've got an Arsenal game there. You also have a Brighton game in Game Week 38, which is not exceptional. And so I have to just drop him for the same reason why I've dropped Garnacho too. And that's pretty much it. With Foden, no changes there. With the premiums, no changes there as well. Salah had a great performance. We expected Salah to have a great performance with Tottenham as long as he was able to start, right? And Klopp obviously cleared up everything when it comes to the relationship with Salah. Salah's going to be an amazing differential when it comes to Game Week 38 captaincy. I don't really think that I'll personally be able to get there, but for the managers who will be able to do it, I think that's a very exceptional punt. The tough issue, though, is that for managers holding Salah this week, I think it's very hard to justify maybe keeping Salah in your team when a lot of the elite players here have better fixtures, even Saka, for example, or just simply have double fixtures, which I think is also another big additional point. If you want to hold Salah and you're very confident about Salah captaincy being a big swing for you in Gaming 38, maybe you can keep Salah, but I still think it's advisable to consider moving towards some of the doublers this week. As far as the forward position, moving over there, not too many changes whatsoever. Wilson has been added to the cheat sheet. I really don't want to touch on João Pedro, Wood, Muniz, Mateta. Mateta obviously scored versus United, and I think you have to be honest and say, look, João Pedro gets to play this United team on Game Week 38. In Game Week 37, he's a doubler. Wood has Chelsea, Muniz has Man City, and Mateta is away from home versus Wolves, and he's also going to have a supposedly tough Aston Villa game. Obviously, Aston Villa have completely dropped off a cliff recently when it comes to performances, but maybe there's no need to overreact to that. But Mateta, and obviously this Crystal Palace team in general, and Glasner has been doing really well. I just still think that he's a differential for the time being. I'd be more confident, for example, in Wood versus Chelsea, to be honest, in Game Week 37 still, just because of how important the fixture is for Nottingham Forest as well. And João Pedro, for me, still remains the king, given the additional fixture. And, of course, Man United at home. I don't think there's anything to scoff at right now with that sort of fixture. As far as Jackson, for me, he remains elite. So does Isak. However, we've started to see that Newcastle are playing 4-4-2. So that allows for Wilson to be within the team. It allows for Isak to remain central, though. So when it comes to the Golden Boot race, we actually thought that Wilson would probably take penalties away from Isak. Or at least that's something that I thought would probably happen, given that I've listened to Wilson on podcasts before, and he's been very, very adamant on keeping penalties for himself. However, Isak took the last penalty, and he missed it. So I don't really know what's going to happen. Maybe penalties are a bit more of a toss-up, even though Isak is clearly chasing for that Golden Boot. But Wilson, for me, is a differential if Newcastle continue to play within a 4-4-2. And, of course, when we look at Wilson, he's a player who, as long as he's on the field, him and Isak in general are amazing when it comes to the underlying stats per 90. So, basically, what I'm saying here is that when you can guarantee their minutes, they're just amazing picks in FPL. With Højlund, maybe he doesn't even deserve to be a yellow pick, but I just think that obviously there is a tier here in terms of Pedro, Jackson, Isak, and Haaland that is above everyone else, and Højlund just has to remain clearly below that bracket. Højlund might be one to stand to benefit when Bruno is out because he might be on penalties. However, with exception to that, really, I just think this United team is so awful that maybe you can really consider Højlund to be an orange pick. Solanke actually has a really good fixture here in Game Week 37. And Tony, honestly, maybe he deserves to get knocked off the cheat sheet just because he's been so poor. But if you've been persisting with Tony, I imagine you've already moved off away from him. I do see him as a differential for Game Week 38, though, when people are thinking about, last-ditch transfers and maybe a move away from Isak if you're not confident in the Brentford away fixture, as an example. Watkins also has to drop. Unfortunately, he's not capitalized on some of the easier fixtures that he's had on paper. Brighton obviously have been a team that have been rolled over by a lot of Premier League teams in recent memory, and Aston Villa had 0.06 XG versus Brighton, which just shows you the level of performance that Aston Villa sort of achieved versus a really struggling Brighton team. So Watkins for me has to drop. Liverpool at home is actually quite a nice game in my opinion, because I think Liverpool, this defense is still poor, but Crystal Palace away, not exactly the best season to close this entire 23-24 year with. So the way I see it, it's not a great fixture, and Watkins has to drop as well. Haaland, the less said about him, the better. Probably going to be a perma captaincy option up until the end of the season. Moving on now to the defense, we have Cucurella being added as an option, Webster, Kraft, and Hall as well. So starting with Cucurella, I think, as I said, at the start of the video, I called out to the change in tactical structure within the Aston Villa game, which allowed Cucurella to invert. For me, that doesn't necessarily make him a better offensive player within FPL. However, what it does make him is potentially someone who's undroppable right now for this Chelsea team. And maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe it's the case that someone like Gusto can invert. We've seen in the preseason as well. Reece James is someone who can invert inside. Not so confident that Gusto, a little bit more of a traditional fullback, can do that. But Cucurella looks to be right now someone who's, first of all, fit, playing very well, and also crucial to the new tactical shape. So for me, Cucurella is very good because Chelsea also have on paper some nice fixtures. Nothing like an aberration like how United have Arsenal or how Tottenham have Man City. So the way I see it defensively, these are good fixtures for Chelsea, and they have kept clean sheets recently too, although probably shouldn't have versus West Ham. Cucurella, therefore, is added as a green option. Webster, Kraft, and Hall, I think, are all differentials, right? Webster and Kraft are the players that I think are more nailed, and Hall, I think, is a bit more of a differential. The reason why I think Webster and Kraft are nailed is simply because of the injuries that Brighton have faced, right? Van Heck potentially being out for the season just makes Webster nailed. With Kraft, we did actually hear from Shar that he thinks he'll come back this season. So if he comes back this season, of course, Kraft is not a pick to go for. However, if Eddie Howe stays true, if let's say Shar's injury is actually as bad as Eddie Howe suggested, then of course Kraft is a good option. We just need to get more news from Shar, from Eddie Howe, and maybe we can make that decision. But I think one positive that we can see, of course, is that Shar was not part of the match day squad in the previous match versus Burnley. So the way I'm seeing it is that Kraft should basically be allowed to play Gaming 37, and that's probably what you need him for. With Brantwaite, he just has such a good singular fixture. He'll probably drop next week, but this is a great fixture to go for him. And even for the managers who are actually looking for a transfer this week, I don't think going for Pickford, Brandt, or even Tarkowski are out of this world as transfer options. Van de Ven just remains as a yellow pick. Reguilon drops, unfortunately, just because when you look at Brentford's fixtures, lack of a double is clear. He is actually exceptional right now, but I think also versus Newcastle, it's fairly likely that they could also lose their clean sheet, despite what we've mentioned about Newcastle away all this season long. But he has played extremely well. We have constantly mentioned that Reguilon has great underlying stats, and no surprise, of course, that he's done well even in the previous week where I played Flecken, for example. Romero gets a rise as well. When we look at, let's say, attacking Spurs, I do think he's a player to go for even over Van de Ven. You can see it too when it comes to the expected goal involvement per 90. You can see it, despite the change in height between Romero and Van de Ven, that ultimately he is the set piece threat within this Tottenham team. And that's just, a personal skill, I think, as opposed to anything related to physical attributes. So Romero is a great option for this week. Gabriel, Paul Guardiola, still for me the top picks. Saliba as well, you can actually technically add him there. I just wanted to create that separation that we have in the midfield as well with, for example, someone like, Odegaard, where I dropped him as well within the midfield position. I think that's fair too when I did that to Saliba, because White for me still gets consistently better attacking positions. Although I will mention that Saliba had a great goal scoring opportunity versus Bournemouth, if you guys missed that chance, where he was basically one-on-one with the keeper. As far as Dunk, he becomes a new option as well. I think with the regression of, let's say, our expectations of United, with the really good performance that maybe bolsters a little bit of expectation for Brighton heading towards this double, that still looks pretty bad on paper. I think Dunk is definitely still an option to consider, considering that Van Heck is out as well, and we probably need to be looking at defenders to replace our players with. Schär, asterisk there, but I think it's very unlikely that he plays. And then within the sort of elite positions, no changes here. Robertson and Trent, for me, still remain amazing picks for Gaming 38. And Trippier, I just don't think he's going to be ready for this Brighton fixture. And even if he's back in training, I just can't see him starting 2 fixtures in Gaming 37. And White, once again, as an Arsenal pick, even good this week, even better next week. So moving on to the goalkeepers to round things out. Petrovic gets a rise from me. We obviously were dealing with the doubt of Sanchez. I probably mentioned that Petrovic last week was someone that you could easily move into. So he's therefore given the credit. Now this week, apologies, of course, for keeping him on the yellow. That's probably an error on my part, even going back towards last week. However, the one change is Onana gets a drop as well. I just think ultimately this United team, with the defenders that they're playing, with Casemiro, the way he's playing, with Evans having to play look at the amount of fixtures that Evans, who apparently was not match fit for game week 36, he will have to play a ton of fixtures heading towards the end of the season, particularly since Maguire has basically been ruled out. I'm just not looking forward to it if I was a United fan. And that's it, right? Onana, unfortunately, will have to make a lot of saves like he does and like he has over the course of the season. But I just think that the chances that are going to be given away are going to be too easy for Crystal Palace to take or for an Arsenal to take. So when you look at the Crystal Palace game, for example, the XG of the chances, I believe, was something like 1.4. So nothing exceptional. But when you actually look at, for example, how the defenders are playing the positions, how they're sagging off people, I'm just not looking forward to how open the positions that United will have to give away to a Newcastle, to an Arsenal this week. And Pope, for me, he's just a little bit of an asterisk because we don't really know whether he'll play the first game. Hopefully he'll actually come back and play Gaming 37. I'm actually very, very much keenly looking forward to Pope as a potential transfer. But if that doesn't happen, of course, we need to sort of reassess things moving forwards. Ederson as well. Look, you probably want to be invested into a defender ultimately within FPL, and I've got to say Ederson's probably someone that a lot of managers with 2 free transfers are probably considering moving away from, just because, and I actually forgot to touch on this, but Guardiola just seems like he is so clearly the option to go to for Gaming 37. If you have the availability, if you, let's say, have Maguire injured, if you have Dalot still, if you have Schär, in any injuries within the defense, it makes a lot of sense to actually pivot from Ederson and move into someone like Guardiola instead. And then actually that would be a good way to use your 2 free transfers. And potentially you have to go to someone like Pickford or Verbruggen or Petrovic, but I think that's a very good position to be in if you're allowed to do that within your own FPL team. And that's it for the cheat sheet for this week. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care and goodbye.